All right, thank you and welcome to the United States Marshals and the U.S. Constitution program. My name is Veronica and I am the outreach manager here at the United States Marshals Museum. This program is made specifically for high school levels, 9th through 12th grade, and we just want to provide that discretion before we begin. Thank you once again. A little bit about our museum, all about the United States Marshal Museum. Our mission is of the United States Marshal Museum is to serve as a national center of heritage and legacy, disseminate knowledge, and inspire appreciation for the accomplishments of the United States Marshal Service. We are located at 789 Riverfront Drive in Fort Smith, Arkansas, along the banks of the Arkansas River. A few of our exhibits are here. We have quite a bit of information about the U.S. Marshals Service. We provide from 1789 all the way to current days, and a lot of galleries providing a lot of specific events throughout their service time. So who are the United States Marshals? And I'm going to allow our guest speaker, it is David Turk. He is the historian for the United States Marshals Service. He's going to answer all the questions that he can within our time on who the United States Marshals are and how they connect their work through the U.S. Constitution. His focus will be on the actual Marshals Service work during the events. And then later on, you and your class can dig a little deeper on the constitutional component of it. Let me go ahead and exit out of this. All right, so here we have David Turk. And David, can you introduce yourself and briefly overview your role as the historian with the United States Marshals Service?
Good afternoon. I'm Dave Turk. I've been I'm the second historian of the U.S. Marshals. The first one was Ted Calhoun, who left in the year 2000. So I've been doing this, and you can probably tell by my long gray beard that I've been doing this for a couple of decades, since about 2001. I've been in this role, and primarily what I do as I do tours, I do educational from the framework of our agency, and one of my accounts is, of course, the museum, which I've been involved with since its infancy and throughout the entire process. But I've been doing this for some time. I wrote the modern Marshals history. It's called Forging the Star, written in 2016. It was a companion book to the first historian's book with the first 200 years of our agency called The Lawman. So, I've got a heavy dose of the Constitution through work over the years. And the agency is interwoven with the making of the founding of the country. So that does really help. So that's kind of the short, brief bio, I guess.
So what are the primary sources and archives you rely on when you're doing your research and documenting the history of the U.S. Marshals?
Studying the U.S. Marshals, you have a wide variety of source material you use. There is a lot written on the U.S. Marshals these days, particularly memoirs, which are getting more and more profuse. But primary source material, we rely a lot on the National Archives and Records Administration throughout the country because they are the primary repository for all federal government agencies. And we do have our, a holding area for records of our, we have copied and so forth over the years, but by no means is that a substitute for what's at the National Archives. Also, the Library of Congress's manuscript room has a lot of the early Marshals appointments inside of it, and rather repositories across the country, such as the Arkansas Historical Commission and the University of Oklahoma Western History Collections has some original records as well.
Now we know that the U.S. Marshals were enacted in 1789 and they're still in function today. So there's a large amount of time in between. Just briefly, how has their role changed from the very inception to the current day?
Boy, that's like apples to oranges. Back in the beginning, a lot of the agencies you see today were not around. For instance, the FBI wasn't there, the ATF wasn't there, and the Secret Service wasn't there. So we did a lot of some of the items that, or some of the duties and functions that they do today. And so we had a much vaguer, much more generalized, all lawful precepts was kind of the quote that they use in the Judiciary Act for kind of canvassing that general quotient, which we always guarded the federal judiciary. But back then we actually were the accountants for the courts as well. We did have federal execution duties from 1790, but we were not involved in other things. What you see, but we were involved in facets of it. For instance, seized assets. We have a formal program today. Back in the old days, they would simply sell from the courthouse steps court-ordered items that were seized. But now it's a formalized program where only 2 agencies can dispose of assets that have been seized. So that's, but we also handled counterfeiting. Back then, and that's now a Secret Service function. And we handled the federal census. That was probably one of the most important activities to President George Washington. And there is an interesting quote that I saw from him over the years. How important this office is, I know not, but he really did say that what was important to him was the tabulation of trying to get that wealth of the nation distributed to see, what the federal census would do. And we'd have it until 1870.
So a pretty wide stretch jurisdiction of job titles.
Yes,
at that time.
we had the fugitive program was actually not a program. It was, it's just something we did. Also, marshals did a lot more themselves. They had very few deputies in their office that they could actually count on. Take the state of Pennsylvania, and the District of Pennsylvania was one of our first 13 that were enacted. And you had the marshal doing a lot of the legwork with perhaps maybe 4 or 5 deputies in his office. Plus, he would keep a list of gentlemen of good standing. Later, the ladies joined in the 1880s. But from prior to that, they would keep, the good standing, lists of good standing of people who've had military experience and so forth that could help them in various places at a moment's notice. Special deputies, now posses or task forces.
All right, so we have a few events that we wanted to highlight during our session today and just get your perspective, a little bit more information about them and to share with the schools. So the first topic would be the desegregation of New Orleans schools. What can you tell us about that?
Well, the interesting, that came and probably is our first start to finish operation that we had in such a scale, and certainly it got great media attention, in November of 1960. Now, Brown versus Board of Education had already passed, of course, and that changed and desegregated the educational facilities for all Americans. And so the schools needed to be integrated. And in the American South, that was a challenge. And I think we had that in New Orleans was we probably had a good, I want to say probably good 100 to 200 deputies involved, but we had to escort the very first African-American students in two schools, William Franz and McDonough 19. And they went through the courts, and the integration was to take place. The problem was most parents pulled their children out of those schools, with the exception of one from William and Franz, and that's who everyone knows today, Ruby Bridges. hall. And the three little girls, known as the McDonough 3 and McDonough 19, and each group had to actually formulate a plan to integrate those schools, portal to portal details from home to schools, with 4 deputies accompanying at all times. And there was a blockade that stretched for a block from each school. And they did this for months before turning this over to the New Orleans Police Department when things had calmed down. And of course, there was a great deal of consternation. There was rioting. There was all kinds of graffiti. You can imagine catcalls, abuse. It was got much worse later, but New Orleans was a little more cosmopolitan than most cities in the South. I know that just kind of barely covers the I just wanted to give that kind of background as far as what was going on. Does that kind of explain it, or do you need?
Yeah, just a little bit more as to why were they called in? Like, why outside of the other law enforcement at the time?
Why the Marshals? Well, the Marshals at that point, after they did Brown versus Board of Education, they were looking around for an agency to enact to desegregate the schools, and they would have to use a civilian agency. You could not use the military. They tried to use kind of a pseudo-military approach at Little Rock in 1957, and it didn't work well. And they knew they would have to depend on purely the guidance of a civilian agency. And at that time, the Marshals Service was kind of going through a lot of changes. And they relegated a lot of our duties into the courts. A lot of those aforementioned agencies were now out there, the FBI, the ATF. So they weren't sure what to do with us in a way at the Department of Justice. But they decided, hey, they have experience going back to the Reconstruction days after the Civil War. It was the Marshals, while they had to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act before the war, after the war, they helped the Freedmen's Bureau. So you had a kind of a two sides of the same coin, so to speak. And we were one of the first agencies to integrate ourselves. Frederick Douglass was our first U.S. Marshal, and that was 1877. So there was some precedent for making the Marshals that agency. I think the FBI was briefly considered, but their hands were full anyway, and J. Edgar Hoover was not high in estimation at the department at that particular moment.
Thank you so much. And so you and your class can continue researching on that. That's the desegregation of New Orleans schools and the connection between the 14th Amendment. So we have the First Amendment, 2 different events that we can talk about. We have the Wounded Knee occupation of 1973, as well as the civil rights protests in the 60s and 70s. Can you elaborate on those?
Which one would you like first?
I'll do Wounded Knee.
Wounded Knee? Okay, well, since it's a singular event. And it's actually a lot more complicated than people realize, because Wounded Knee was actually the culmination of 2 other events that happened. All 3 were with the American Indian movement. And it goes back to the occupation of Alcatraz in California, in which the Marshals were sent in to reclaim some of the land there. It was based on it was kind of the park didn't exist at that time, or they were just putting the park together. The actual prison itself had closed, and the Marshals were sent by court order to clear. And we were at the end. We were not throughout the entire process. But in 1972, the American Indian movement wanted a particular ceremony in Washington, D.C. And they didn't get the location they wanted or the time they wanted. And they ended up occupying briefly the Bureau of Indian Affairs. least a section of this group. It wasn't the entire group, of course. And as a result, the marshals were involved with trying to extricate folks from the building. We even had one of our top guys undercover as a custodian. I know we're way beyond Wounded Knee here, but I have to kind of explain this because it's all interlocked together. And they had an agreement in which the occupiers from AIM ended up going back to leaving the building, and they went straight from there to the reservation in South Dakota, the Pine Ridge Reservation out there. And it was a very split situation there too, in which they were not happy about the situation, and they ended up taking over part of that reservation as well. And they sent our special operations folks out there to maintain roadblocks and so forth by, of course, again, by court order. And we ended up doing this for 5-6 months. From February, I believe, no, actually it wasn't that long, February to May of 1973. They had maintained camps by that time. And even though it looked like we were kind of occupying and making, permanent camps there, and there were cartoons where our guys were growing beards and all that sort of thing, there actually were simply roadblock watches. And unfortunately, there was gunfire exchanged during that particular period of time. Eventually, it went to court and was resolved, but it took a long time to resolve. A lot of people compared it to the first. The Wounded Knee was from 1890 was military, and that resulted in the death of I believe it was Sitting Bull, who was killed there. But yeah, the marshals who were there, though, it was probably, as far as, if you ask folks what they were doing, we were simply doing roadblock duty, maintaining it. But some of the fighting did get very deadly. We did lose one of our marshals. He got severely wounded with a spinal cord injury by sharpshooter's bullet. So we did have quite a bit of that. Does that kind of answer? I mean, I'm looking at a kind of a general viewpoint here.
Yeah, just some information that can extend learning at a future time. So thank you so much for sharing that. Now, the 1960s and 70s, civil rights protesting.
Okay. Well, we have different kinds of protests. You're talking about perhaps the Pentagon. And I'll use that as my biggest example, and that was in October of 1967. Interestingly enough, the deputies that were used there were the same deputies that integrated the schools in the South. A lot of them were the same people. Unfortunately, all you did was you could kind of see them in terms of popular culture in like Forrest Gump, the movie Forrest Gump. I believe there's a scene of them there. And Norman Mailer wrote a very unflattering book about us called The Armies of the Night, which, in my view, I've read it, and, it was very biased, and he was very angry, and I think we arrested him. So of course, he was not, his description of deputies were not kind. But what happened there was the anti-war movement had moved to federal property. And one of the duties we had to do was to guard the federal property. And we were asked by the folks at the Pentagon to help guard that. Now, for some reason, these folks wanted to levitate the Pentagon. Now, how in the world you're going to do that, I have no idea. But those were the 60s, so you have to kind of look at life a little different. And I think their goals were understandable, but it's just they kind of charged on the Pentagon, even if they weren't violent. They weren't a violent bunch, certainly, but they could be if they wanted to. And unfortunately, we had to use clubs at a couple of points when they, repeatedly were warned not to go near the Pentagon. They they kept coming in force, and they could have started beating folks up if they wanted to. So it got a little bit scary there for a minute, but I don't think it was quite as bloody as being portrayed in Norman Mailer's book. I don't think anyone suffered any permanent injury from that. But it does kind of border on a very interesting constitutional talk. It's certainly the premise for that.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So let's look at the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Marshals' contribution to those events.
Well, I mean, I don't think necessarily with that event, but I think we were involved with, early on, like I said, in the Reconstruction period, with ensuring the rights of all to vote and in federal elections. So we were kind of your original proctors there, especially in the South, but also in the North. We do have several of old ribbons from folks that we made special deputies, and we kind of similar to the census program. We had a very similar situation there. We maintained order in various cities, primarily in the South, but ensured the African American vote was very important. I mean, that was, of course, very, very tested over the years. But that was the one thing. So when this happened with the Voting Rights Act, I think that was the culmination of a lot of these things.
And then they can research more on that as the 15th Amendment, providing all the citizens at that point the right to vote. And so, so we thank the U.S. Marshals for supporting and helping with that. The last event that I have hits us into the years 2000. So we have the year 2000, Elian, Gonzalez. So yeah, we have the 4th and 5th Amendment, but the Marshals, they have nothing to do with that component. What was their involvement with the Elian Gonzalez court hearing?
And that's very important that you said that, because there's a picture that was made, a news photo that was snapped at everyone assumed was a deputy U.S. Marshal, and it wasn't. It was from the Immigration Naturalization Service. We didn't. The court was ordered to. And it was called Operation Quincy, by the way. It was what they called the Elian Gonzalez detail. It was actually done in several places. I was around for a lot of this, but the young man was brought to us from the INS, and then once they left, I guess they left that immediate area, Miami area, and they were put under the protection of the U.S. Marshals. And first, we set up a compound near Y, Maryland, and it was an old plantation house. And they would have to set up various, make sure that he was secure, because there was a big fear that somebody would come and try to take him. And so we had to kind of, I think because of our maintenance with the other protective programs, such as the Witness Protection Program, this Operation Quincy was largely going to be an interesting bent on that. For instance, some of our deputies who were there, they kind of switched in and out on duty there. One of them told me specifically that he had a tough time keeping up with the young man because he was so energetic. So he had to put a pink bubble gum helmet, kind of colored helmet on him. So he could keep track of him, especially when it got twilight. So, so it kind of worked well. And actually, he seemed to not be affected by any of it. And that was the goal. I think the goal was to try to keep the situation calm. After a certain time, we had to leave Y, and we brought him back into Washington, D.C. And eventually, the Attorney General made the final decision on him to go back to Cuba. But that during our time, and we had him for quite a while. But it was different for us, but it wasn't bad. It wasn't a bad situation for us at all.
So it was mainly of protecting and keeping a watch on the child as opposed to any other part of the event?
It was a purely protective detail. Whereas we've done portal to portal details on judges. We've done home details, set up equipment to make sure that no one could get in. But we were very successful in what we were trying to do, and also to make sure that he could maintain a semblance of a normal life. I mean, it was very difficult for him, of course, but we did our best. And I think it did pretty well, I think, overall. I don't think he even thinks bad of us today.
There you go. Now, talking about trying to keep track of him, that leads me to my next question here, which is, how does the Marshal Service continue to adapt and modernize in response to changes with the laws, emerging laws, enforcement, and the challenges that we have today?
That I can answer a bit, because we've had to do this in the past. Whenever there has been a change in law that requires a protective measure, for instance, we have done this in the past, and we've adapted procedures as we need to do them. I mean, that it sounds archaic, but I can give an example. In 1991, we guarded clinics, and we were told, or churches were being burned in 1995, and we had to do a special operation for that and to protect them in order to do that. So we've adapted with issues that evolve with the times in that particular way. So we've, if anything, the fact that we're small, I think, helps us there. The culture of change is not as hard for us.
Now, are there any other notable marshals from history who made significant contributions to the USMS that we haven't talked about?
Boy, you're talking about those who from the 1960s era, or any particular era?
Any particular that makes significant marks within the service?
Well, I'm not going to mention the Old West ones because everybody knows those. The Wyatt Earps, I mentioned Frederick Douglass already. What I didn't mention was perhaps one of the more interesting deputies, and probably one of the ones I was closest to, was Al Butler. He passed away in 2013, but he was integral to training. He was one of the 4 big deputies who trained all of our deputies in the modern era so that they could handle all of those controversial times. Anytime that we would have to integrate a school, New Orleans, Oxford, University of Alabama, Pentagon, so all of that was based on training that we formulated, civil disturbance training that Al did and developed a great deal of from 1958. So he's definitely one.
Go ahead.
And then there's deputies like Kirk Bowden, who accompanied James Meredith literally undercover. The others didn't even know about this particular side detail that was done through the District of Columbia office in 1962. And this was because you needed African American deputies to accompany him off campus, because you did not want, to cause all kinds of riots off of campus when he needed to go visit someone or head home to Jackson or go to Memphis. So there were probably 3 to 4 deputies, and which Kirk was one, and probably the one who brought the most attention to the detail itself. And he later became quite prominent in DC.
Now, I have a final question for you. So how can the general public and researchers access and learn more about the history of the United States Marshals Service?
Well, we have a very good website, but of course the museum is always, I always encourage kind of the 1-2 approach. We do have a pretty good historical part of our website, and it kind of fills in, but the museum itself, of course, has a great website itself. But if you really want to see that, and certainly I would encourage folks to take a look at some of the various books and memoirs in the recommended reading area, and which I believe the store actually has there at the museum. But I think it's fantastic that people do study it to look further into what happens. I can only give you the kind of topical view. There's all kinds of ways to study, but that's what I would recommend. Does that kind of answer that, or do I?
Oh, absolutely. And how can they reach you, or are you reachable?
I am reachable. Actually, if you go onto our website at usmarshals.gov, to the history section, it's under who we are. They just redesigned our website, so it doesn't quite look so old and cluttered. So you'll see that my contact information is there. It's at david.turk@usdoj.gov if there are any questions.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you guys for viewing. Now, this is going to be recorded, so it will be uploaded to our social medias for later review, and we'll have it up soon. Thank you again. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your input and just insight on the Marshals Service and for all that you do for us. All right.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.